In the last lesson, we created our cloud function to generate an ephemeral key for a given Stripe customer, but right now we have no way of calling that function. That's what we are going to work on first in this lesson. So I'm back here in the Stripe documents for the standard UI components for iOS, and we're still in step 1, set up an ephemeral key, which we've done with our cloud function. But it says here that after you've added an ephemeral key endpoint to your backend, you need to set up a way for your iOS app to communicate with this endpoint. In your app, you should make your API client class conform to the Stripe Customer Ephemeral Key Provider Protocol, which defines a single method, create customer key with API version. When implementing this method, be sure to pass the API version parameter along to your ephemeral keys endpoint. And we have some example code here. So this is right here. This is the method for the Stripe Customer Ephemeral Key Provider Protocol. And then this is the implementation. Their example uses Alamofire. We are going to be using Firebase functions since that's how we wrote our cloud function, all right? So let's go back to Xcode. And we are going to need to create a StripeApi class. So I'm going to right click on our Stripe folder here and say new file. And this can be a Swift file. We'll say next, and we're going to call this StripeApi. And we're going to say create. All right, so let's initialize our class. I'm going to say class, and this is going to be StripeApi. Actually, that's going to be underscore StripeApi. And this is going to conform to NS object as well as the Stripe protocol. So we'll need to import Stripe. I'm going to say import Stripe. And so we're going to also implement the STP ephemeral key provider protocol. And then the method that we need to implement is create customer key with API version. Okay. All right, so this create customer key method says here that this creates a new ephemeral key for retrieving and updating a Stripe customer. On your backend, you should create a new ephemeral key for the Stripe customer associated with your user, which we've done, and return the raw JSON response from the Stripe API. All right, and then the key that we get back, we are going to use to initialize our Stripe customer context class. Okay, so let's get to it. Like I said earlier, we are going to be using Firebase functions to communicate with our cloud function. So we're going to need to import functions, or I guess that's Firebase functions. And it says no such module. Let me double check our pod file, make sure we have. Oh, looks like we do not have Firebase functions here right now. So let's go ahead and add that. I'm going to say pod Firebase /functions. I'm going to save that. Then I'm going to need to open up a terminal. And let me see here. I'm in the Cloud Functions directory. I'm going to open up a new tab and then cd to the desktop. And then I'm going to cd into our project. So I'm going to say cd artable and say enter. Then I'm going to say ls to make sure I'm in the right place. Looks like I am. So I'm going to say pod install. And that's going to install the Firebase Functions SDK for us. All right, very good. That's complete. So I'm going to come back to our Stripe API file. And now, let me make sure this auto completes now. Firebase Functions. There we go. All right, so it's really easy to work with Firebase Functions. Just like when we used to work with Alamofire, we would say alamofire.request, and then we would get the completion handler, right? So with functions, we say functions.functions, then we say .https callable, and this creates a reference to the callable HTTPS trigger with the given name, okay? So we have a name here, and that name is the name of our cloud function, which we've created in a VS Code and deployed to our Firebase project. So it's create ephemeral key. I'm just going to copy that, come back to Xcode, and paste that right there. And then we say dot call. And we have a couple of options here. We have a completion handler, and we have the ability to also pass in data. So this executes this HTTPS trigger asynchronously, and we pass in data. This is the one we want, and we need some data, okay? So again, going back to our create ephemeral key function that we created, we were talking about how we are going to be passing data from our client app, so from Xcode, to our Visual Studio Code. We're going to be passing a data object that is a JSON object that will automatically be deserialized and that we can access here. So we have data.customerID, data.stripe_version. So here in Xcode, we need to first create that data object and then pass it right here in the data. Okay, so I'm going to say let data equal, and we are going to create a dictionary here, and we're going to give it the key stripe_version, and we're going to pass in the API version, which we get right here as part of the create customer key method. So I'm going to say API version, and then we're also going to pass the customer_ID, which we get from our user service. So where is that user service? Here we go. So we have our user service, we have a user object, and as part of our user model, we have the Stripe ID, okay? So we are going to say customer ID user service dot user dot Stripe ID. There we go. So we have our data object. We can pass that right here, data. And then with our completion handler, I'm going to press return, and we get back a HTTPS callable result, which we will call result, and an optional error. Okay, so this is going to invoke our cloud function. We are passing to it the customer ID and the Stripe version in our data object that we send. Here in the cloud function, we extract the customer ID, the Stripe version, and the UID. We do our UID null check, and then if everything's looking good, then we contact Stripe. We ask them for an ephemeral key for this customer, and then we return that key in this result right here. Okay, so first let's do a check to make sure that everything went according to plan and we have no errors. So I'm going to say if let error is equal to error, then we can go ahead and debug, print that error dot localized description. And this method, create customer key, this has a completion that it is expecting of type Stripe JSON response completion block. And if we take a look at that, we can see that it has a JSON response and an error, okay? So if we have an error here, we are going to need to say completion, and we will pass back nil for the JSON and the error for the error. Okay, and then we'll return out of this function. However, if we don't have an error, we need to get the key from the result, okay? So the way we can do that is we can say guard let key is equal to result.data as, we'll cast it as a dictionary of string type any, and then we'll say else. If that fails, then again, we're going to set our completion, and this will be nil for both. And then we will return out of the function. However, if we do get the key, then we will say completion, and we'll pass in the key and no error. So we'll say key and nil. And that finishes up that function. So again, just to recap what we're doing here, We are going to use this method here, create customer key, to contact and invoke our cloud function on the back end. We pass the Stripe version and the customer ID. Those are the two required fields to create an ephemeral key for a given Stripe customer user. We invoke the function using functions callable, and we tell it which cloud function to invoke by giving it the name. Then we say .call. We send it the data, and we get back a result and an error, optional for both. We do a check to make sure there are no errors, and if there are not, then we extract the key, which we returned right here in our cloud function. And then if everything goes according to plan, we return the ephemeral key right here. All right, so back here in our documentation, that finishes up step 1. So I think that's a good place to finish up this lesson. In the next lesson, we will start on step 2, where we set up the customer and payment context classes. All right, I'll see you there.